Good morning and welcome to this week's recruitment discussion with Jump. And this week we're looking at KPIs, and we're looking at KPIs that actually drive business growth. We said last week we started to look at trends and stuff like that, some really interesting trends that I took from several different places. Average fill rate. Average fill rate is at the moment going upwards, which is great news. It's gone from around about 19% in 2024 towards 30% on the contingency no win, no fee basis, which is really good. Pipeline efficiency, it's now taking on average 7 job orders to make one successful placement. And that's a 14% conversion rate per individual job order, which is quite low. Time to fill is now at 40 to 40 days, and the candidate funnel is at 1.1% of candidates who apply for a role actually receive a job. Some interesting comments that came out though on international fill rate. The UK, as I say, is between 19 and 30%, heading towards 30%. America and Canada is 30% plus. New Zealand is at 46.7% and Australia is at 45%. So really interesting that different areas have got a far better fill rate than the UK. Factors that drive low fill rate is contingency model, agencies that work the same roles repeatedly and competitively leads to lots of wasted effort. According to Recruitment Insider, talent scarcity, 56% of UK agencies said there's a tightening on talent pools, and that's their biggest challenge. And the way to improve, the top 25% of consultants and businesses say their fill rate is higher by focusing on candidate engagement and clear communication in candidate. And that's been moving their average fill rate in the UK to above 45%. So they can see significant revenue increases by not only stop focusing on clients, but focusing on candidates. Dave, you obviously love data. As always, Dave loves a bit of data from there. So let's kick off, Dave. Let's look at this and look at KPIs. I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation to be had. When you first sit down with a recruitment business and look at the measures that they put in a framework, not what they tell you that they track, but what actually they use to make decisions, what do you actually find? How do you sort of compare that to most leaders think their business looks like to actually what it actually genuinely looks like?
Yeah, it's a great question, isn't it? And it's horses for courses for so many businesses in so many sectors. I always start where I can at the beginning and sitting down with the founders, the MDs of the businesses, is looking at their strategy. So what is their strategy for example, 2026? Where do they see their business at the end of the year? Where do they want it to be? And then break that down in conversations with, well, what are you going to measure to get there? Because we all know what the standard measurements are for a recruitment business. And we know that if our interview ratios are better and our close ratios are better, then our placement ratios will be better. That's kind of obvious. But are they the things you need to measure to hit your strategy, or are they the things you're measuring because that's what everybody measures? So you said in that opening with some data there that customer engagement, customer experience, those that have better customer engagement and customer experience, yeah, are going to close more business. Well, are you measuring that? Is that one of the KPIs that you use to challenge your leaders with to measure your business? Because if you're not, then you're not going to hit whatever targets you set in that area. So, what are the targets you're setting and how are they aligned to your strategy? And I find that many companies have lots and lots of measurements, but they're not always linked to the strategy or the direction of the business. And if you take some companies or some leaders in companies don't have a really good written down strategy that says this is what we want to do. They have an idea of where they'd like to be, but not a strategy of how they're going to get there. And I think you need that to then attach the KPIs to measure that success.
I'm going to come back to some of those points in later questions, but I think the consistent gap between what leaders believe they measure and what's actually driving decisions is really important. I think the most common picture is, as you said, billing tracked monthly, some activity numbers logged, but they're rarely interrogated, and a vague awareness that the data exists somewhere, but no one actually acts on it. And I think that's a lot of people are sort of seeing that. And I think the specific moment in most of the engagements I have with leaders for the first time is when we sort of go through an audit of their KPIs and what they've been running. They tend to run on instinct and revenue, and rather than actually looking at a real measurement. And once they realize what they've been sort of missing, it gives them a genuine curiosity about what they could be doing and should be doing to drive their business quicker, faster down the line. I think because very few businesses truly have, and I'll go back, I'll use this conversation a little bit later on. Very true businesses have a data analyst who harvests the data
Yeah.
and runs their data for them. Their KPIs tend to be the standard measures that measures past performance, or they're simply measuring numbers that don't equate to anything other than people being busy fools, such as call times or call numbers. It's just driving people for people's sake. And I think once you interrogate those numbers, you start to see where the inefficiencies of the business truly are. And I think every business, no matter how small, from solo to multinational, all produce data. It's those that truly use that data that succeed, and how they read that data and act accordingly to that data shows where they're going in the future. And I think so many people look at past data rather than post data, and it's really interesting to see what we'll do. Again, we'll talk about that as we go through.
Yeah.
In fact, we'll talk about that now. Actually, let's move that question now. We've talked about the difference between leading and lagging indicators as the most important shift as a recruitment leader can make. From your own experience, both running businesses and advise them, what does that shift actually feel like in practice? And what does the leader suddenly start to see that they couldn't see before?
I think just thinking about this, it's easy to look at it and say, well, these are the KPIs. This is what we're doing. This is where we're going. The key measurements for me are your people happier? Are they more resilient? We've been through a challenging 12 months or so. Yeah, it's a difficult thing to quantify, but when you walk onto a sales floor, you can see it. If you've got engaged people, happier people, resilient people that take the knockbacks, that's a good measurement for you as a leader to look at how your people are coping. What's staff retention like? Are you keeping your good people, and are you able to develop your people who are, say, less good, and they are now performing? Because the market is coming back. I was at the Recruitment Expo yesterday, and the general feeling, both among the tech suppliers that were exhibiting and some of the people walking the floor, was actually the market is getting better. We're going to have to fight harder. We're going to have to work harder to get more business, but it's there. So are you maintaining, are you keeping your good people? Are they more resilient? And the ratios that you look at then, for example, what you mentioned earlier on, greater percentage of people placed, greater percentage, for example, of contractors. Contractors coming off, in March is normally the end of March is normally a bit of a hit for some companies when contractors finish, particularly in the public sector. Are you reusing those contractors somewhere else if they're not staying where they are? And if you can see those particular data, KPIs, are improving, then you've got an engaged workforce because they're looking after the contractors they've got. Or from a customer experience point of view with the permanent staff, they're hand-holding permanent staff through a change of job, and they're staying. And they're staying on for more than 13 weeks, so there's no rebates. So those sort of measurements, if you've got engaged people, happier people, those sort of measurements from a KPI point of view are going to be better.
It's interesting, that comment, fight harder, work harder. It's a comment that comes out a lot when we start to come out of recession, start to pull away. And I think once I wrote the question, my immediate answer in my head is the most leaders that are here today and most leaders that are going to watch this later on know the difference between leading and lagging indicators, or KPIs, and what that does. And I think the experience of watching business transformation, it transformed being from reactive to anticipatory. And I think that anticipation is really important. And I think a lot of consultants, and I remember sort of going through this sort of transition myself, where have a bad month, but actually data told you they were going to have a bad month 3 or 4 months before because you could see the data and it would show, but we only see it when it shows up in their billings. And I
Yeah,
think it
yeah,
was having that time to intervene and manage the consequences early rather than having to manage the consequences when it actually happens. And I think there's a big lag between what the people do today and when that billing starts to materialize in the P&L. And that's the bit we need to talk about. So I think the most important distinction for recruitment measurements is it's not between good and bad KPIs, it's between the number tells you what's going to happen and the number tell you that what has already happened. And we tend to look at what the numbers are telling us that have already happened and not the numbers that are going to happen. And so I think that is, if I looked at that honestly, I think it's an admission that we default to lagging indicators and completely. I understand why we do that because it feels more concrete because it's an actual figure that we can see and that's actually done. Okay. But it actually takes in terms of leadership and habit and weekly discipline to change that pattern to look at leading indicators, what's actually going to happen in the future. And I think my top 5 leading indicators would be CV to interview ratio, interview to placement ratio, the speed that our placement goes through the actual pipeline. So how quickly do we get things through that pipeline, and new client acquisition rate. And I think we spend a lot of time looking at those lag, revenue per consultant, client retention rate, average deal size and fee, placement success, and I like to understand what placement success looks like. And rather than mentioning how many placements that we make, I used to measure how many placements stayed beyond 12 months or with a contract period, how many stayed beyond their contract period. And then the final one is financial forecasting. And we know because we've been dealing with a number of clients when we look at financial forecasting and the gap between what is predicted and what is actual is huge sometimes. And I think
yeah.
they're the things that we start to think about. If we start to really push on those leading indicators, the things that lead to a placement, rather than just concentrating on those lagging indicators, I think we'll see a huge difference in what people look at from a business, but how they manage their people. And it's genuinely how they
Yeah, yeah,
manage their people. And that
yeah.
goes back to your comment about making people feel happy and people feel warranted in work. And people feel happy if they feel that they are performing. Now, performance doesn't always mean that it has to be the end line, the financial line. It can be what's leading to that financial line. And um, I'm doing some work with a client up in the northwest at the moment, and we're doing some work on their and how they're seeing their own performance. Their consultants can start measuring their own performance. And we had one person there that was looking to leave and looking to leave the company. But when we looked at her lead KPIs, it said if you leave now, you're walking away from a massive amount of business. The next quarter, she built 70 grand. You know, hadn't thought about what was she'd done, how much long she'd spent building that. But now we've started to say, right, now we can start to see that money coming through. That's what we're looking at. So I think it's a really important thing that those lead and lag positions are important because her lag position was awful, but her
Yes.
leading position was absolutely superb. And it started to show that. So here's a different side of it then. When we dig into full KPI conversions and we look at the recruitment funnel, you know, and we look at recruitment business for the first time, CV to interview to ratio, offer to placement, where do you most commonly find the biggest breakdown? And what does that breakdown actually tell you about the leadership of the business, the delivering the business?
The biggest breakdown for me comes back to trust. So, as a leader, you trust the data that you have in front of you. So and so's got 3 interviews for every placement, the normal stuff. But you don't use the word you used earlier on, Howard. You're not curious to find out what's behind it. So you look at the data, but you're not examining what's behind the data. So if you want your interview placement to be 1.5 to 1, which of course we'd all say is very good, what are you doing about that? What training is needed? What learning and development is needed for the consultants? Are your managers doing that? If you have managers, or if you're the owner and you're directly, the people are directly reporting to you, are you doing it? What data that is static for the last 3 months, yeah, are you wanting to see for the next 3 months? And what individual skills do the individual consultants need to improve that data? Do they have really good candidate control when they're trying to place permanent staff? How many of the people they place stay for that 13 weeks? Yeah, if there are any dropouts, what happened? You know, asking the questions of the consultants, listening to the answer, and as a leader being able to understand what's behind that answer, and behind every answer like that will come a learning and development need, will come a training need to get the people better, to get them to perform better. Because we've always said if you've got somebody who's 120% of target, it's often easier to get them to 130%, 140%, because they're motoring, because they're successful, because they want to succeed, than it is to get an 80% person of target up to 90%. But what a difference to our business if we can put individual training and learning around those people to get the 80% to 90, to get 130 to 140. It makes a huge difference. And each person is different. The KPIs may be the same, but each person is different. So you need to understand the motivation of the people who are driving the KPIs and what's behind that. It is very much about individuality and making sure you understand why it is that they're performing the way that they are.
So if you think about the funnel, and everyone sort of works on some variation of the funnel or whatever they want to call it there, and I hope that most leaders in the audience want that conversion to be better.
Yes.
But most have never actually looked at the stages of leading and lag indicators and where they appear in the funnel, and therefore have any rigor around that situation. And I think the most common patterns to me are, a business sending a high volume of CVs with a low conversion rate. That signals the quality or the targeting of the client. There's a problem rather than a pipeline's a problem because the pipeline's there. Then look at roles that look strong right up to the offer stage, but then where placements collapse. Is it because candidate management broke down? Is it because client management broke down at the final stages? Leader dimensions that sit behind both of those. What does that low CV to interview ratio tell you? And what does that, people dropping out, what does that tell you about the briefing, the interview, the client relationship in depth? And what does that sort of say about you as the leader that you're allowing those things to happen? And I think, if you start to look at below conversion rates, what does that actually tell you about your recruitment process? And I think that's the bigger thing to me, is that we're blaming the people when actually is it the process that's at fault? So these are the questions that I think KPI should be challenging on a weekly basis, as it challenges and it shows how quickly things can change, but it also shows how quickly that we can change things back again to make
Yes.
things work.
Yes.
So I think the funnel is not a report on the consultant. I think the funnel is a report on the systems and the standards that the leaders have allowed to build around themselves, but they never change those standards and they never change what's actually happening. So the consultants are the ones that are trying to make the numbers match, but they're not trying to deliberately break the KPIs. They're probably sometimes struggling, and they're struggling because they see the KPIs deliver such a low conversion rate. They're thinking, oh God, I've got to do an awful lot of work for such a small amount of conversion. And I think that's where KPIs start to break down if we don't actually dig deep enough into the KPIs and why those KPIs are producing those results. We just go, those are the results, but actually something should be behind that. What is it that's behind that? Is it the market? Is it the process? Is it the people? Is it the candidates? Dig into it. Has something changed? And I think that's the bit that we tend not to look at. We just look at a figure and take that figure rather than looking behind it and say, right, what actually makes that figure? What makes it happen? And I think we're sort of saying something similar there. But it's important that I think that we all start to understand is that our consultants aren't there trying to break our KPIs. They are there trying to achieve the KPIs, but the
Yes.
conversion rate is so low that we've got to do something about it.
Yeah.
Let's move that then, okay, onto something about tracking. One of the things that strikes me about building sort of KPI frameworks, especially ones that we put into our clients, is how it separates client development into three areas. When I spoke to most clients, they don't separate their clients, their KPIs into three areas. And we look at new clients, build, lapse clients, and buying clients frequency. So, in your experience, sort of advising businesses, why do so few leaders measure these separately? And what does tracking them together actually reveal?
I think some of the answer to this is in the way that CRMs create data for us to measure. So if you look at a CRM, for example, you wouldn't have clients measured in those three ways. Yeah, so we don't measure it because we can't report on it. Now we could decide as leaders what we want to measure, and we can then ask our CRM provider to create a format where we can load up that data in that way. Yeah. I just don't think it is in the DNA of most recruitment leaders when they're looking at new business or existing business to divide their clients up that way. We do it, Howard, because that's the way we're training some of the clients we work with and some of the owners of of companies that we work with to take a look at their client base and their prospect base and divide it that way. But I don't think most recruitment businesses do it that way. And they're very happy if they're seeing an upward trend. We are winning more clients. What about your lapsed clients? What about all the clients that you traded with in the last 2 years, say from 2024 back to 2021? What's happened to them? We've done a number of exercises on the floor with a number of consultants and various clients, and we've used the old sticky note paper, sticky yellow post-it notes, and a flip chart, and we've used the walls, and we've got them to stick all their clients that they've dealt with in the last 5 years, and trying to say, well, which of these aren't you trading with now? What's going on? And most don't know because they're focused on today, not focused on the next 3 months, not focused on, well, I haven't got time to develop this client because I've got to hit my targets today. That to me comes back to leadership. Our business has got, for example, 20 clients, and in the past 3 years, it's had 70, but we don't trade with 40 of them because one of them went to an MSP. One of them got merged into another business. There's all sorts of reasons why these things happen. But have you actually gone back? And are you measuring what's happened in the past? Because that could very, very much inform the future. So I just don't think it's something that people do naturally or are provoked by their CRM to do naturally, but it's a relatively easy thing to do.
I think it's a large commercial blind spot. And I think by tracking it all, if you track it all in one, it masks the facts that maybe single revenue numbers hide because there's three completely different stories about the health of the business behind each revenue number, whether it be new clients, lapsed clients, or buying clients. And I just wonder, when listening to you there, I wonder how many leaders now are quietly trying to calculate which of the three categories in their own
Yeah,
revenue
yeah,
is
yeah.
actually coming from. Is it new? Is it lapsed? Where's it coming from? And I bet deep down, most of them know where it's coming from, but that overpowering drive to fill a role for a client actually is driving them. But when you think about, worth celebrating that our fill rate's gone from 19% to 30%, but that's 70% of the time that you're wasting. So what can we do? And I think this brought it home urgently to me when I started to look at my own businesses, when I mapped my clients and I mapped them properly about where I was getting revenue from, and therefore where was the gaps. The things that you're looking at, have my lapsed clients come from people going elsewhere, or have they just fallen through the gaps? Have I looked at my billing clients, and is that billing slowly decreasing, or the number of fill rates slowly decreasing, and I haven't quite noticed it yet because billing is there and thereabouts, etc. So I think I think that most businesses have and I'll use this in sort of, no, I'll use it in most businesses. Most businesses have a top number of clients that they get the largest percentage of their billings from. And what that actually does is by measuring all your clients in the same way, it masks where your inefficiencies are, because some of those clients could be growing, okay, and it's only when they stop growing does it start to, the mask slips and we start to see that veil. And I think we've got to start to sort of bring in a little bit more thought in what we're doing with our KPIs. So if you look at, say, buying clients, we've talked about that buying frequency. Is it declining? But are the leaders looking at that straight away? Is it declining because we're losing market share to a competitor, or is it declining because that client is declining itself? So are we then looking at our new business? If I looked at what percentage of my revenue came from calls to new clients, I'd probably find that's a very small percentage. But why? Why is that? Is that because we're spending too much time of our 70% trying to fill roles that we just aren't going to fill? So I think we've got to start to think about how we do that. And I think the experience that I've had in the last 24 months with clients when we start to open this, stop, think and breathe. And I think that moment when every recruitment sees the mask has been lifted up and the data is showing where that mask is and the KPIs are telling them what is potentially coming down the line. And I think people keep saying recruitment's not rocket science, but most KPIs that we measure prove that it's not rocket science. But what rocket scientists do, as soon as there's an issue, they look at the data that's identified the issue and then they start to address it. They don't leave it for months and months and months until it becomes the problem. They address the issue first and foremost. And I think that's the problem that we've got, is that our issues are masked by bigger billing clients until it becomes a problem. And I think until we change that, we're always going to have a problem. Gwyn, I've seen your question. We will come back to that too. Can we describe a KPI format for predominantly temporary sectors? I will come back to that. So we will cover that question off at some point. Okay. So we talk a lot about building pipelines, but almost we talk about solely client pipelines. I know that we've been working on certain clients where we built talent pools or help to build talent frameworks where we can measure that as a business asset. But what does that matter as a metric, not just in practice? What do you typically find when you ask a recruitment leader to show you their talent pipeline data? What does that generally sort of bring to you? And part of this KPI, Gwyn, will be part for you here in this question.
I think a lot of recruitment companies, if they're big recruitment companies, they're measuring lots of different things. And in the bigger companies, the consultants, and this is a generalization, so forgive me if it comes across as too general, but the consultants are king. The resources are there to help the consultants. And if you're really good, you may get promoted to be a consultant. Yeah. So automatically, there's a division between the people selling the business and the people finding the talent. The reality is, and we know, particularly in the UK, but it's happening elsewhere, the workforce is shrinking. So the people that find the talent should be up here, but we don't measure them that way. That's why the niche businesses are really succeeding against some of the bigger players, because the niche businesses are focusing on X number of talent with X skills, and they know the market. And they can go to any company and say, that's okay to deal with this big player. But let me tell you, there are 37 people with these skills and the data's there. You've got the tools now to be able to do that. I know all of these people. I know all of the candidates that have the skills that you need. I can tell you when they're finishing. I can tell you where they're working. So if you've got consultants that do that, and they may not have a resource team because they know the market they're working in, that's the niche way. And that is successful. The other way is the neat way. And neat for me is it's neat when the consultants and the resources, they may be paid in a different way and they may be paid different salaries, but there's a real focus on talent. I've used the story before. One of the guys that worked for me back in the day when I was at Spring never wanted to be a consultant, wanted to be a talent sourcer. Well, how important are those people now? We called him then, those days, a resourcer. Yeah. But he carried on his career. He now leads a resource function. 20 years on in his career, he still leads a resource function. But yeah, I don't know what their metrics are in that company, but I bet you with him as a leader, they're very, very good. So you've got to work out what market are we in, and are we in a candidate short market? Then in that case, the people looking for the skills are as important as the people placing them. Or are we in a market where we're just generalists and we're just going for everything we can find? Well, there's a different question and a different discussion to be had about that. But even the bigger businesses are now trying to grow by having lots of micro businesses. By having we're now focusing on this one niche area and then another consultant on this niche area and another consultant on this niche area to try to capture the candidates. So I think candidate experience, candidate performance, candidate generation, talent generation, those things are really important and they're big discussions to have with your clients.
I think if you want to move the needle with regards to your placement ratio, this is the operational gap. And I think it determines whether a business can actually deliver on its commercial promises or not. And I think what you've described there is absolutely right. So I always think if you're having to advertise the job because either you don't have a candidate or you don't know if there's candidates on your database to fill the role, then by de facto, you've got to advertise first. And that is a poor way of doing recruitment. It's also an expensive way of recruitment. So what you're talking about, every job you take on, you should know whether you've got candidates that can fill the role. And you should know straight away, if you've got the candidates by name, then there's a likelihood you're going to place that role or not. How many candidates in our database do we have that can fill that role? Then we look at how many similar roles have you filled in the past 6 months? How many CVs, interviews, and offers has the client made, as well as how long has the role been open and how many of the agencies are working on it? Now, these things we talk about, but these things we very tend to measure. But I always think that when I started to really drive both in CP and in my own business, when I started to drive how many candidates have we got that can match the client, if we didn't have those candidates, then we took a view whether we would work the job or not. And if we didn't want to work the job, then we didn't work the job. And guess what? Our placement ratios went up and our placements went ratio because we were working jobs that we could fill. But the time that we spent or the time that we gained from not having to work those jobs, we developed a business development strategy behind that, looking for clients that look like those clients. And guess what? We got more clients. And guess what? We could use our talent pool more and more and more. So I think, if you are taking roles for roles' sake, then 9 times out of 10, you're going to work those roles. But that's working those roles knowing that you've only got a maximum of a 30% chance of actually succeeding. Now, if someone came to me and said, you've got a 30% chance of doing this, there's not much chance I'd actually do some stuff like that. And I think building talent pools comes in 2 forms. And I think the form of building a talent pool, and this goes back to, especially a temp marketplace and a contract marketplace, as well as a perm marketplace, is if I segmented my CRM, it would be candidates that I've spoken to in the last 8 weeks that I know are available and can work, and candidates I've spoken to in the last 6 months that have updated. I'd have those 2 segments straight away all the time. Every morning, especially in a temp marketplace, I'll be asking my consultants, can you give me 10 candidates that you can place straight away? And if you can't give me 10 candidates, it says that you don't understand your marketplace, you don't understand your database. So I want the chance of filling roles to increase by using the data. And I think the competitive reality of 2026 is the businesses that can respond within 24 hours, either with data for a permanent role to say whether we're going to work the role or not, or what we're going to do, or on the contract side and the temp side, a candidate that can do that role, you're the ones that are likely to succeed. Okay. And that's where growth is going to come from. So I think that contract to temp bar is even higher. And so understanding and penetrating your database for candidates that can fill those roles or going through compliancy is an absolute must. And I think that's what people don't tend to measure, is that I've got 55 candidates that are available today to do that job. How many of those 55 have I placed into a job? Rather than I've got all of these jobs here that I'm looking for, but I've got no candidates to place. That to me seems the wrong way round. I should be leading with my candidates first and working from there. So if you're close enough to your clients, the temp will tell you every day what you need. Your contractors tell you on a very regular basis. But if you're close enough to your clients on a perm, they'll tell you what they need. And I think, therefore, pre-building your candidate database and developing the data from there on your CRM will increase your fill ratios exponentially,
Yeah.
very, very quickly.
Yeah.
It will also reduce your reliance on job boards, LinkedIn, and social media, but we should be using those anyway to rebuild our candidate databases, push them away. So the answer isn't whether you can fill the job or not. The answer is whether you walk away or blunder onwards within that job. And I think the one thing that all clients want from an agency is very simple. They want a good quality candidate. And the conversation is, what are your chances of filling the position? Or what's your chance of saying to the client the thing they hear from every recruitment agency? Let me go away and find someone and come back to you, rather than let me come back to you with the data of how quickly I can fill that role or how quickly that role will not be filled, etc., giving your client that knowledge. That starts to move you from being just a contingency operator to a trusted operator, because they trust what you're saying, then they will change. That comes from your data. If you said, yeah, we've got 50 people in this marketplace, got 10 in this marketplace, we have 0 people in this marketplace, and these are the reasons why, people then start to trust you because you're giving them data about what they're looking for rather than just promising them and then never delivering on that promise.
Yeah.
If you think competitive tender, especially in the temp market, you're normally not the only supplier in that marketplace. If you're even of one of 4, that's a 25% chance of filling that role. Now take 30% of that 25%. That's the chance of filling that role. That's madness. That's madness.
It is.
Yeah. So if we look at it in a slightly different way, almost every recruitment leader we work with has tried to run some form of KPI board at some point. And almost everyone describes them the same experience. The weekly meetings happen, the numbers get reported, but nothing actually changes. So what goes wrong? And what's the difference between measuring culture that generally drives behaviors to one that just becomes another Monday morning ritual meeting?
Actually, I'm going to argue against the premise, because most of the clients that I work with and most of the people I talk to in the industry, whether we work with them or not, actually use the KPI stats really well, and it does work. If they've narrowed them down to what works within the business, what me as a leader, what I want to know, what I want to get out of them, the weekly meetings actually become a very good weekly meetings. They become fun meetings. The data is shared properly, and that's kind of the ideal of where you want to get to, isn't it? That you want to be looking forward to those meetings. And if you're not doing very well, you kind of want to be dreading those meetings because you don't want to show yourself up. But if you've got a culture which rewards success and praises success and offers assistance and help and guidance to those that are doing less well, then those weekly meetings become a really good pulse time for how the meetings, how your business is performing. So I think the KPIs that you've set, if they're the right ones and you're regularly measuring them, then carry on, because that's how we drive our business. The numbers don't lie. In 30 years, 40 years of recruitment, with all the changes we've ever seen, the basic KPIs that I learned in, back when I started at Computer People and was learning my business, they're still in place now. We've got more tools to help us achieve them. We've got a different workforce. We've got a different economy. All of those things are different, but actually getting the ratio down, ideally to one person for one job and one interview and one placement, the ideal, that's still a driver. So if you've got meetings that measure that, keep them. You may need to freshen them up a bit. I've got clients. The weekly meeting starts on a Monday, and they have a meeting in the morning and in the afternoon. They have a sprint meeting, all sorts of things. Yeah, they just physically sometimes turn them around. Yeah. One client takes them in the car park if it's a nice day. Yeah. And they're not even looking at the screen. They're having shout outs and stand ups and all that sort of thing. Well, that's great. If you need to chivvy your staff along a little bit or you need to just freshen it up a little bit, do it. But if you've got the KPIs that you want that drive your business that you're seeing success with, great news.
The comments that you said there really sort of struck home, and I'm going to sort of challenge your comments as well. So we'll side battle
Oh,
off
just because I challenge you doesn't mean that you
No,
can
no,
challenge me. Oh, well, that's good.
I'm
This is all right.
going to challenge back here, Dave. I am going to challenge back. Okay. The reason I'm going to challenge back, basic KPIs, and we're still using the basic KPIs from 30 years ago. Okay.
Yeah.
30 years ago, when I started in recruitment, your average biller was expected to bill 120K. The
Yeah.
average biller now is expected to bill 90K. Yet salaries have gone up. The number of requirements have substantially increased, even though they're decreasing at the moment, etc., etc. But our performance has gone backwards. There must be something in there that's done that. And I remember that. I'll go back to when I was first came into recruitment. The KPIs were there to be hit. There was zero rationale about how to hit them. And if people were not hitting them, it was just work harder. And I remember when I started to sort of twig, I don't have to make as many calls as everybody else. I don't have to do this as anybody else
Yeah.
because I
Yeah.
was working from a quality point of view, not a quantity point of view. And I stopped working with poor clients. I stopped working with poor candidates. I was a contract recruiter, and therefore I could spend more time finding better clients with a better candidate base, and therefore it saved me a lot more time. And I wanted to work with clients that saw me as a prospect, not treat me as a suspect. And I think the single most issue that we have is that we review the numbers without the question that gives the measurement an actual power. Your ratio is this. Well, why is that ratio that? So therefore, we should have a set standard of KPIs in a business, but understand that everyone's different in that business.
Yeah.
And there'll
Yeah.
be a variant on the output that's
Yeah.
required to get the input that you want. However, the one thing that I understood is that both the leading and lag, you could not allow one KPI to slip. Okay. Even if you were above target, you were above target because of the lag KPIs that were coming in. And if you want to carry on above target, then you have to look at your leading KPIs. And that was it, that sort of area of neglect that most leaders have on high performers who are billing it out of a certain number of clients and then having problems. And I think it's the lack of new business and the resuscitation of lapsed clients that we have a problem with. And I think this is normally caused by low fill rates or high CV ratios and things like that. And when I start to think deeply about KPIs, I start to think that most people will ignore a KPI. I mean, how many times have we heard this? Okay, I don't have to worry about my KPIs because I'm above target. And
Yeah.
I hear that an awful lot. And I think we've got to think that as a manager, you've got to look at your dashboard of KPIs and start to look at the actions you administrate or the actions that you manage. And I think there's a very difference between a lot of leaders who look at the KPI boards and then it becomes an administrative function, just administering my KPIs, rather than taking an actual management decision-making process over it. And so I would sit down and do individual meetings on a weekly basis and a one-to-one just about the KPIs with people. But then as the business has got bigger and the managers got bigger, I start to do that with my managers as well. But what I would look at is where there were slight dips, where there were slight changes. And I'd start to ask the people, why is that changing? And then say, right, if this carries on over
Yeah.
a certain period of time, what's that going to do? And that became something that was very visible, that once people understood that I was going to start to ask them the why, not what's happened, why, what's going to happen, then they start to change. And I think this protects the review process, and it goes whether it's weekly, monthly, etc. But the numbers never became a ritual; it became a consequence. And once you start to measure the consequences, consultants then could start to say, I've dipped this week on number of CVs sent or number of this or number of that. That means I've got to get that up next week. Otherwise, I'm going to start to drop again. And that didn't matter whether it was just by 1% or by 10%. It was the same thing. So I think your leading and lag KPIs give you the structure, but the managers need to be able to see that individuals are monitoring it as well as looking at the overall picture, so you can start to help drive that picture for today, the end of the month, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, etc. down the line. Because if you don't, then you're going to suddenly have this little shock that you knew was coming, but you were just afraid to address it because you were afraid of the consequences of talking to a biller that may be above target about you're behind here, you're behind here, these are the consequences. And yet, how many companies do we know? And I'll go to the smaller business where they've been reliant on a number of large clients. Those clients stopped and now they're all scrambling trying to get new business. But they'd ignored all that data about they're not doing new business for 18 months, 2 years, 3 years because these clients have been billing really well. Okay, that's the problem. And I think that's the bit that we've got to get our heads round. If we don't, then we've got a problem. Yeah. So last question very quickly. Okay. I think this is more of a personal rather than a professional question. When you think back to running your own recruitment business before you were an advisor, what did your own measurement blind spot actually cost you? And what did you understand about the KPIs rigors today that wish someone had told you face to face those many years ago?
It's a simple answer. I'd like to think that I'm a very trustful person. I looked at the data, I looked at my people, I absolutely believed in what they were telling me. What that led me not to do was dig a bit deeper and investigate a bit further. And so business was lost, or we didn't win business that perhaps we might have won. We didn't extend contractors that we might have extended or made placements that we might have done, because everything the consultant said to me, I absolutely believed. I hired these people. I trusted these people. What I didn't do was invest a bit more of my time to just check the salient facts. Is that right? Does that make sense? And I think that lack of curiosity by me over time led us to lose a bit of business, because I should have been a little bit closer to the detail, a little bit closer to the customers, a little bit closer to what was going on. So that's a mistake that you kind of live and learn with. I'd rather have my attitude of I believe in and trust in my people, but at the same time, sometimes you need a little bit more they need a bit more of your time to make sure they're going the right way, whatever the KPIs say.
I think I'd already started down this journey quite a long way, but hadn't really understood the actual full benefits of digging behind the figures. And it was only when I became a director at CP, at part of the Adecco Group, that they presented me with a data analyst for my whole of my business. And that data analyst every month gave me an interpretation of my business, every person, every manager, every team, every business, and gave me lag and leading data. And it was really eye-opening. And it showed me that understanding from a business point of view was critical for the future. And from an individual and team point of view, it was presenting that day-to-day basis that need to happen. And I think it was spotting trends in the data, showing individual traits in teams and in people. And therefore, I could pinpoint individual strengths and weaknesses in teams and in people. And therefore, I think you mentioned it in question 1 or 2, I could start to build my training programs around those things. So I could start to say, right, these things we're doing really, really well. Let's train hard on those because they accelerate away and perform really well, which we did. These things we're not doing very well. Let's either train them to eradicate them or train them to make them a strength. And we did. And that started to move forward. And that didn't matter whether it was front or back office. It was both sides. And so if you use your data correctly and it shows you this, KPIs aren't just a number to be hit. KPIs should be flexed and moved as the capabilities and capacities of your team grow. And it can increase and it can decrease, okay? But it's what they are showing. And that is there. And I think what's the silly saying that says, a butterfly beats its wings today in Yorkshire. In a couple of weeks' time, that'll be a hurricane in the Caribbean. And I think that's what we tend to see. We see the butterfly wings today of one little drop in something, and I think that's what happens. And I think we need to sort of change that, because KPIs are so important, but I think we tend to use them as a stick rather than as a way to motivate and show people that the true path to development and a true path to success. And we are very stuck in your comment there about we had KPIs, from 30 years ago that we're still using today. That really needs to be addressed, and how we can change those KPIs and do what we want. Okay. I think from Gwyn's point of view, if I was looking at my temp businesses, the simple thing I'd be looking at is my fill rate. How quick can I fill? And I'd be looking at my candidates that are available to fill and take to my clients. And they're the three things I'd start to measure very, very quickly.
And Gwen, the other thing I would add is using a bit of data. How long do your clients take to make a decision? If you're getting requirements from clients, temp clients, how long are they making a decision? Are you advising them that actually the market's moving, they need to make faster decisions, and you therefore will continue to find them good people? But don't work with clients that can't make fast decisions in a temp market where talent is short. Have a look at that data as well, and use it to go back to the client with and say, actually, over the last 12 months, it's taken you 3 days, 8 hours, whatever it is for your sector in your business.
So if you want a workbook, remember to send us an email to info@jumpadvisory.com. Just put workbook in the title and subject line, and I'll send a workbook for this across for you. Next week, we're going to be looking at a very different conversation. We're going to look at the difference between leadership and management, and how they differ when you should be lead and when you should to manage. And you'd be surprised the difference in performance it makes when you manage people or when you lead people, and what goes on from there. Ladies and gents, thanks for your time. Dave, thanks for your time. Look forward to seeing you all again next week, and those workbooks will be on their way. Thank you very much. Cheers. Goodbye.
Bye-bye, everybody. Have a good week.